Now we're continuing our series, Wellness in the Wilderness, and our speaker today is Tom. Why don't you give him a big hand?
Hey everyone, so nice to see you. It's actually quite emotional, sat at the back of the room, seeing a room full of people worshipping, and knowing in faith that you're worshipping along with us at home as well. And I was just thinking of the words of the psalm, I think it's 122, that said, I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. And I was thinking, God, this is so good to be with your people, worshipping you, just going for it in person and online. So as Joel said, we are thinking for these couple of weeks about wellness in the wilderness, how to actually do all right when times are tough and when times are good, by taking the pattern, the rule of life, the example set down in the Ten Commandments, and applying that to our lives and thinking, how does following these 10 commandments help us to do all right in the times that we're living in, which, as Joel mentioned, undoubtedly have been pretty tough times. So last week, we looked at Commandment 1, 2, and 3, which are all about putting God first. If we want to experience wellness, wholeness, completeness in our lives, it's about starting with putting God first and above all else. And today, we're going to look at Commandment 4. I don't know if you follow the news avidly or if you're a sort of armchair historian, but the more you observe human behavior, the more you can make predictions about the way that humans are going to behave. And one of the tragedies of watching the news over a period of time is that we see this pattern that emerges when people throw off a tyrant, a dictator, and begin tearing down his statues. And I say his because tyrants do seem to have, in recent years, in fact for most of history, have been men. And there's these moments of just enormous, liberation and joy, and people driving around town tooting their car horns and pulling down the posters of the oppressor. But so frequently, 2 years down the line, the oppressed people that have been set free are actually no better off, or sometimes in a worse situation, because what replaces the tyrant, the dictator, the chaos that follows, often leaves people in at least a very bad situation and sometimes a worse one. And the Lord, in his great wisdom, knew this. He knows this. So when he sets his people, the Israelites, free, we're talking hundreds of years before Jesus, the Israelites have been captive for 300 years. They were slave labor to the Egyptians. The Lord, in his wisdom, knows that without firm guidelines, people will often end up in chaos, being no better off than they were under the oppressor. And so God, in his great kindness, 3 months after he led the people out of Egypt into freedom, he gives them really firm guidelines by which they can prosper, so that they break that cycle that we see repeated so often, even today, of oppressed people actually not finding the freedom that they think they're breaking through into. And God begins to lead his people over a long period of time, partly due to their mistakes, towards prosperity. And those same patterns of living that he set down to see his people, the Israelites, set free, they're still setting us free today. So we're going to read together the words of the fourth commandment. I think they may appear on the screen behind me or on your screens at home so that you can read along with us. They are in Exodus 20. Here goes. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that's in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. I don't know if you're familiar with the chain of toy stores, The Entertainer. The Grant family that own The Entertainer toy store chain, they've been following Jesus for many years, and they've spent a lot of time thinking about how to apply the fourth commandment to their business. And they've made the decision that as a family, they're not going to work on Sundays. And as they read this, they saw that it applied not just to them, but to people that they had power over, their employees. And so, although, at least in non-pandemic times, Sunday is a massive trading day, particularly in the run-up to Christmas, you can take millions and millions and millions, they made the decision that they're going to run their business on lines whereby they don't open or trade on a Sunday. Now, logically, that doesn't make a huge amount of sense if you're trying to maximize your profit. But if you're trying to apply the first 3 commandments first, about putting God first, then the headline in your life is not, am I maximizing profit, although that's important in a business, it's, am I following God first? And I don't know how they're trading at the moment, but I do know that in the 2008 economic crisis, when many of their competitors were closing down, they continued to grow through that crisis, despite the fact they've got this highly unusual business model. Now, I am not going to tell you today how you should apply the Sabbath in your own life. We know that Jesus was a huge advocate of the Sabbath. He followed it. It was his pattern of life. We also know that he reminded us that the Sabbath, this principle of taking one day off in 7 and keeping it holy and resting on it, that he said that that was made for us, for our benefit. We're not made to serve the Sabbath. The Sabbath is made to bless us. It's God's gift to us. But I am going to draw out some principles from this passage, and we're going to trust that together the Holy Spirit helps us to apply these principles to our own life and to work out what does it look like for me in my own life to apply the Sabbath. So firstly, this principle of the Sabbath, taking off one day every 7, keeping it holy to the Lord and resting on it, it wasn't invented in the 10 Commandments. It already existed. In the 10 Commandments, as we just read, it reminds us that it already existed. God himself worked for 6 days, it tells us in Genesis, creating, and then rested on the 7th. So this principle is like it's tied into the DNA of the universe. It's not some law that God gave Moses at that moment, for that time, for that people. It's tied into the way that the whole of the universe works. And the Israelites, although they had been in slavery for 300 years, they knew this because they were already observing the Sabbath before this moment happened. You can see that in Exodus 16 if you want to look up. So God is reminding them of something highly important that already exists. Remember the Sabbath. If we decide that we're going to live without this principle, I guess we're sort of deciding that we're not going to follow this pattern that God has laid down within the DNA of the whole created order, within the DNA of the universe. And if we want to know God's immense blessing on our life, which comes in so many different forms, part of it is saying yes to this incredible gift, this incredible present that he's given us, whereby he says, you get to take one day in 7 completely off, just keeping it holy for me. Principle 2. So principle 1 is the Sabbath has always been there. Principle 2 is that work is actually good. Now, I know that might not feel like all of your experience all of the time, but work is a good thing. It was created by God. And when I say work, I'm not talking about being in employment, although that's a big part of it for some of us. I'm talking about being productive, living productive lives. God encourages us in the 10 Commandments. For 6 days, go and be productive. It's part of what you were created to do. Again, you can see that in Genesis. Before it all goes wrong, God says to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, I've given this to you for you to work in it, for you to cultivate it. Being productive is good. So if you're one of those people that just loves being productive, I know that that's not all of us, but some of us really love that. Don't beat yourself up about it. That's a God-given quality that he's put within you if you love being productive. That's created by God. It's also a reason why in the New Testament, in 2 Thessalonians, There's some really firm words of people that have actively chosen not to be productive. The New Testament also affirms that. Work is a good thing. I know our employment doesn't always feel like that. It's super painful when we're out of work and we're looking for it, but God has created us in whatever our lives look like, whatever format that looks like, to be productive. Principle 3 is that stopping and resting after 6 days of being productive actually has nothing to do with how busy we are. Sometimes it feels very frustrating to stop and not be productive when you feel like you haven't had a particularly productive week. It hasn't been as productive as you'd have liked it to have been. Maybe you can just do a bit more. And sometimes it feels super hard to stop and to stop being productive if you just know you've got heaps and heaps and heaps of stuff to do. But this principle of stopping 1 day in 7, of keeping it holy to God, and of resting, it's got nothing to do with how busy we are. Again, we can see that a bit later on in Exodus. It's like there's a bit of a question and answer session going on, you can imagine, between the Israelites and God. And they're saying, yeah, but what about this situation? Yeah, but what about that situation? And the Israelites were going to go on to predominantly be farmers at this period of time. They lived and died, literally. They ate or didn't eat based on the success of their harvests. And if they didn't plow at the right time and they didn't harvest at the right time, they were stuffed. But God says really clearly to them later on in Exodus, even when you're plowing and even when you're harvesting, even then, take 1 day in 7 to keep it holy to me and to rest. This is God's gift to us. It's highly countercultural to take a day a week and to rest. And you might think, well, it's not that countercultural because most people don't work 7 days a week. Yeah, but we're doing stuff 7 days a week. We're filling our time with stuff. I had a really interesting conversation this week with some wonderful, wonderful people who said to me about a couple of weekends ago, they said, that was our last weekend of freedom. Oh, so what do you mean by that was your last weekend of freedom? And I said, well, it was the last weekend we were still properly locked down where we could just do what we wanted. Now, if you're anything like me, lockdown has not felt like freedom. It has felt like completely the opposite. But I guess in the middle of that, for some of us, maybe particularly for really busy people, it's given us enforced rest. And I felt that was such an interesting turn of phrase that just as we're coming out of it, like, oh, that was freedom, when we didn't have to socialize all the time. Socializing's good, it's from God. But where we didn't have to run to parties all the time, where we didn't have to go to clubs all the time. You know, there's blessing by stopping and by resting. I encourage them to keep going with stopping and resting as long as they still invited me over, because I didn't need to count within the socialization thing. Slightly hypocritical, maybe. They cook really nicely. So that was the third principle. It doesn't matter how busy you are. Second principle, working backwards, was work is good. And the first principle was remember the Sabbath. It's always been there. Fourth principle, last one we're going to look at super quickly, is that rest like that takes planning. It doesn't just happen. You have to factor it in. Time fills up. It just does. You have to plan in order to rest. And particularly you'll know that if you've got very busy lives and you're responsible for other people, e.g. children, like you actually have to plan. And you see that theme running through, again, through Scripture, that people would work harder in the run-up to the Sabbath because they knew if we're actually going to have a day that's a bit more restful, it might not be able to be completely restful, but a bit more restful, you have to plan for it. But all of this whole thing, is all given for our benefit. It's in the DNA of the universe that God says, I've given you this day, 1 day in 7, where you get to rest, where you get to consciously connect with me. We do that all the time, but to consciously connect with God, it's his gift to us. And in an age that is infused with anxiety and worry and concern, the Sabbath by itself is not a magic answer to all anxiety. There are lots of really useful things we can do to manage anxiety. I mean, sometimes that will include seeing a doctor, getting some professional advice. But the first thing on the checklist when anxiety begins to rise within us and wellness begins to take a dip is, am I taking this gift, this commandment, this instruction that God has given me seriously? Because he tells us that just like him, we're to rest one day in 7. It's a gift. It's a blessing.